we don't want to make ourselves seem more than human by taking ourselves out of the ecological system, and we don't want to make ourselves less than human by denying the responsibility that we have toward the other creatures around us.
Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And in this episode, Nathan, a non-vegetarian, is going to do his darndest to convince me, also a non-vegetarian, to be a vegetarian. This should prove very interesting.
Yeah. So, okay. So what's the foundation for this is, I think all of us know people who are vegetarians, friends, family members who are, and I think there are a wide variety of good reasons to do that. You'll notice in reference to our previous podcast when I was talking about my conversation with Joyce D'Silva, she said she was a vegan but didn't feel like everybody had to be. And I was trying to, sort through my best faith attempt as a Christian to build a moral, a moral case for vegetarianism, theologically speaking. And the reason I want to do that is because I think theologically is the best way to get there. In our previous podcast, we kind of talked about how, naturalistically, it's not really a question of whether or not some mammals are going to eat other mammals. That's kind of given. Once you get into the other reasons that people are vegetarians, some of those are nice, or they're based off of kindness, or different forms of conscientiousness that are all a little bit contentious. And there's wonderful, really thoughtful, good literature out there on that I don't find convincing, but it's worth engaging with if you're looking at this and considering being a vegetarian. So let me outline how I think the best case for being a vegetarian would be that I've come across. And I'm going to draw a lot of this from a guy named Andrew Lindsay, who's the director of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. And actually, Harvard has a center now for animal rights. So, previously, Cameron, you'd asked about why is some of this becoming a conversation, and it's because some of our leading institutions are now developing legal theory and pursuing, conferences and seminars and all sorts of publications on the topic, and have been for some time. But let me outline for you the Christian case for being a vegetarian, and then at the end, maybe we'll have time for me to say why I don't quite think that holds. But would say, well, is that a terrible waste of time to argue one side of the point and then come back around to where you were? And I'm going to say, no, you learn a lot about what you think theologically when you go through an exercise like this. So here we go. All right. So starting premise would be that you would say, okay, let's look at initial conditions in God's original intent. And it seems like on the surface that God's original intent for humans in, if you're taking just a classic conservative reading of Genesis, is that humans were designed to eat plants. You have that as part of the Genesis story that I give you every green plant and for food, and same thing for the animals. And then you don't end up with animals dying until later on. Well, you don't end up with people killing animals until later on. So keep that in the back of your mind. So original condition, God creates people to be vegetarians. And then a heavy argument would be the final conditions. Oftentimes relying heavily on Isaiah and the wolf and the lamb and the leopard and the goat and all of that kind of thing lying down together, that it looks at this ideal no conflict between animals' future for the final redemption and consummation of all things. So you could easily say, look, humans were created not to eat meat, and in eternity they won't eat meat. So beginning and end, pretty clear, God's intent there. And then you come back around and say, okay, particularly as a Christian, Jesus comes around and he talks about all kinds of things that the Old Testament allowed, but that weren't part of God's original intent. So for marriage, for example, and divorce, he would say, Moses allowed you to do this because of the hardness of your hearts, but it wasn't God's intent for the originally, so this is why you should live this way. So there's a backwards looking at original intent for our behavior, and then there's a sense in which we're looking forward to the coming kingdom, and we're modeling our lives now in such a way that are a testimony to that which is to come for the future. So you would say, if the future of the fullness and the redemption of all things includes humans not eating animals, and we were originally created not to, then as people living lives pointing to this grander, narrative, then there's the foundation for your moral case for not eating animals, because it parallels the foundational case for a lot of other things, from sexual ethics to the treatment of other humans, from, when we start with the original created intent and the future perfect outcome, here we are in the middle of that. How do we point to those things? Well, do you have thoughts or comments on that overall outline, Cameron?
Yeah, so we have a picture that begins in the garden when there's a harmony that on the face of it doesn't seem to include the eating or the killing of animals. And so that's part of that original harmony. Then we have a prophetic tradition with lots of a wealth of imagery that involves, again, a harmony with animals. And so there's a sort of prophetic component to this as well. And so if we're living in this manner, this is part and parcel of kind of being in anticipation of that future harmony. So I can see, am I articulating this along the lines of?
You got it right. And then then there's one more step then, right? There's one more step then from the Christian, and this starts to dabble in some liberation theology and other things as well. I'm not quite going there yet, but Andrew Lindsay would also say, look, you very much have the servant leadership model of Christ, that the more powerful defend the interest of the weaker, and that as humans, the incarnation teaches us to look out for those who are less than and other than, and that we have a moral duty to care for creatures in a way that causes them, minimizes their harm, whether that's, and then there are all sorts of little rabbit trails you can go down through here of whether or not killing an animal that knows they're about to be killed, or secretly, ambushing them and then killing them in a way that they don't know, all that. But the idea being that there's something in the life of Jesus then that teaches us that we have a responsibility to other creatures, in a way that should make us at least register their interest in the moral decisions that we make.
All right. So am I jumping the gun? No pun intended here. When I start to ask questions like, all right, so Jesus ate meat, and then we have the vision that Peter gets in the book of Acts, of course, with the carpet-like thing coming down with all the different animals, Peter, arise, kill, and eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Is it too early to bring those questions in here now?
Well, I think this is where it gets tricky so the vast majority of times that the Bible talks about animals, it's almost always in an analogy to something else. So people will often point to the proverb where it talks about even the righteous care about, the welfare of their animals. Okay, so that's the second half of that proverb. I don't have it right on top of my mind, but the first part says, even the kindness of the wicked is cruel, but the righteous care even about the needs of their animals, something like that. So it's embedded in that the righteous care about the needs of their animals, but it's positioning that against the concept of even the attempted kindness of the wicked is cruel. Or when you look at the Isaiah passage, is that a statement about the ecological reality of the future, or is that about the nations who go by the names of these animals and their future harmony together? When Jesus talks about knowing that a sparrow falls to the ground, is that about God knowing about the sparrow falling to the ground? Yes, but the bigger point that he's making is about God knows and cares for our needs. Or Peter's vision before he goes and meets Cornelius with the blanket being lowered down, is that about humans eating meat, or is that about the Gentiles being included in receiving the gospel? Gentiles, being received. And so therein is that the Bible doesn't lay out for us. And Joyce D'Silva wrote a book called Animal Welfare and World Religions, in which she's basically making the case, if you're Muslim, if you're Hindu, if you're Buddhist, if you're Christian, here's what your holy book says, therefore you shouldn't mistreat animals. And she, in one of her talks, says, the New Testament is a bit of a desert when it comes to material on actual moral prescriptive elements on how it is that we should treat animals. Now, part of that could be just because it wasn't really a question in the first century. But all that to say is I'm sympathetic to the fact that there isn't a high degree of specificity on that. However, there is enough there, I think, to say, you're absolutely right. Jesus killed trees to make points. He, ate fish. He, I'm sure, ate lamb at the Passover. So it's there, but it isn't. The New Testament doesn't seem to be offering a redemptive arc or making deep points on this topic.
Well, a couple of observations here, Nathan. So in the last episode, when we were debriefing on Nathan's talk on Unbelievable, he did lament the fact that when he was on that program, he couldn't go on the rabbit trails that we do, but you're on Thinking Out Loud, so now you can, and now we can. So I think it's worth pointing out here also that this is a question. It's just as a side note, but all of Nathan's remarks about the symbolic role that the animal imagery is clearly playing in Scripture shows you that this is also a hermeneutical question, which is important.
Definitely.
It's just I think it's worth noting that, and that's not to say you don't take those passages seriously, you don't take the animal imagery seriously, but in both of the specific examples that we used, clearly some powerful symbolism is going on, both in the Isaiah passage and in the passage in Acts, where, of course, this is the dream that precedes Peter's visit to the house of Cornelius, with which he struggles quite a bit, and, as we find out in the book of Galatians, continues to struggle because it's such a paradigm shift for him. So it's worth noting that. The other piece I wanted to pick up on here, Nathan, and because this is something, and it's related to the hermeneutical issue, but this is something that troubles us as modern readers of the Bible in general. So Joyce D'Silva rightly points out, she's writing a very topical book on, our treatment of animals and, in different faith traditions, and the New Testament is a bit of a desert. But again, it's funny because we can have a certain topic in mind. Something that comes, an analogy here is when people look at Genesis, for instance, and they want to see in it a sort of manual for the mechanics of creation, and it's not really written like that. Well, similarly here, if you're going to the New Testament, all right, let's build a foundation of theological and biblical ethics for the treatment of animals. You're in a little bit of a tight spot because not necessarily the point of the New Testament as an overall, series of letters and books, but also, like you pointed out, Nathan, as just sort of an aside, not a question that was dominating the cultural moment in which the New Testament books were written. I mean, people pretty much took for granted that animals were there for our use, and that part of that use would be nourishment.
Well, see, but it's more than that. It's not just an assumption, because let's go back to Genesis and look that the consumption of animals becomes a biblical command. So, walk with me through this for a second. So you have, and here's just, not to cast doubt on anything, but just think about this for a second. From what's in Genesis, is the injunction against eating, is there an injunction against eating animals, or is God saying, I give you every plant on the entire planet, and you can eat every vegetable and every green thing except for this one fruit? So is that statement about giving them every plant, is that about only eating plants, or is that about you can eat anything that's green except this one thing? There's a question there. Second question, what was Abel doing farming sheep? He's sacrificing an animal to God. And then it just goes on from there. God kills an animal to make clothing from Adam and Eve. The whole ark experience, they're allowed to take multiples of the clean animals that they're allowed to eat onto the ark. And then after the whole ark episode, and you have the new covenant, you have the covenant with Noah, that's when God then says, and you can eat the animals. Which I think if he had said you could eat animals before you got on the ark, then it wouldn't have been a salvation, it would have been a cruise. Because I think that's what people do on cruises, they eat lots of animals. But the thing there is like that God's permission to eat animals was not a result of sin, and was not a result of the fall. It was a byproduct of a covenant that came after that. And I think that's significant to say that it wasn't a post-Eden thing, it was later, for what it's worth.
Well, no, say it again, though, Nathan, because I think some of our listeners will need to sit with a thought for a second, probably, because you don't hear that said very often.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought through it in those terms either, but oftentimes we think, okay, Adam and Eve in the garden, they sinned, and then the whole world gets messed up, and then, animal death comes into the, and human predation and all that as a result of their sin. But the way that Genesis lays it out is that God doesn't say, go for it on eating animals, and then I'm debating whether or not they were before that or not, but I'm saying that the clear command to go ahead and basically establish agriculture, even though Abel had already been doing it. But however you want to line that out, the point of the point I'm making is that eating animals was not a result of the fall. That it was a gift to them from God after, and this is important, they were allowed to eat animals after they had saved all of the animals. So God uses humanity to save the animals and then says that they can eat the animals.
It's important.
And so it's almost like they go through humans and animals get bound together in the salvific narrative of what God is doing in all sorts of ways. And they're morally linked all throughout the Old Testament of like the people sin and the land becomes a haunt of jackals. And then even in Romans 8, you have creation groaning because somehow God links creation to humanity so that when humanity is saved, creation is redeemed along with it. At the same time, humanity or creation groans under the abuse that humanity inflicts upon it when we sin because it's also still linked to us. So it's not quite so simple. Which oddly enough, one of the favorite, I think, things is like, let's pick on American, religious fundamentalism and their views of Genesis in order to,
Sure.
Yeah, it's an easy punching bag. However, you have to have a literal 6-day view of creation in order to say that the ideal is vegetarianism. And so it's just a little bit funny to me that you have to adopt a very narrow, very rigid reading of Genesis in order to prove that point. So take that for what it's worth. But eating animals is not a result of the fall. Therefore, you do seem to have a divine command for the consumption of animals. So by the time you get to, Jesus or every other culture or the rest of history, eating animals is not a question, except for religions that believe in reincarnation. And so even Pythagoras, the famed, all you triangle lovers out there, was a vegetarian because he also believed in reincarnation. And so this idea that you don't want to eat a reincarnated form of a being is there. So any religion that has reincarnation is going to have some qualms with eating animals. But other than that, I think it's by and large not a question that Scripture really wrestles with. Now, eating the blood is a big deal because even in the New Testament, they say when they write to the Gentiles, they say just still don't eat meat that's been strangled or that has the blood in it. So that honoring of the life force or the life within something is still there. So the Bible isn't silent on it by any stretch of imagination. So I think we want to ask big questions about what is Genesis actually saying about humans' relations to animals. I think we want to say, is Isaiah giving us an actual depiction of the future? Because actually, if you read that Isaiah passage literally, it would mean that you could farm sheep without having to worry about any predators killing them. And so I think every sheep farmer in the world is like, huzzah, that sounds great. You can eat your meat and the wolf won't. The marriage feast of the Lamb, the wedding supper, I eagerly desire to eat this, eat bread. There's a sense there. It is interesting, I think, that Jesus uses bread and wine instead of meat in his analogy of, but he does say, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. So it's not.
He does. Yep.
There's not enough there to say, okay, this should be obvious that there is a, I think from my understanding of Genesis, of my thoughts on what is real about what the future looks like, on the commands of what God's heart is in his creation for the animals, and the teachings and the lifestyle of Jesus, that for all of those reasons, I think there is a morally permissible way in which you can consume other animals, but that is all predicated on the concept of treating a thing for what it actually is.
Okay. All right. Well, so now that we've established that you have done a terrible job of trying to talk me into being a vegetarian, but given us, I think, a good overview of the case that is sometimes made there, I want to move us forward a little bit and talk about some of those specific items that we weren't able to get to on that first podcast when we were processing your talk on the Unbelievable podcast. So, given what you've said, there ought to be some protocol that orders our treatment of animals. So the first item I think that's worth talking about is the treatment of animals in post-industrial societies in which we find ourselves. So I'll use some of the buzzwords here that often get thrown into the conversation. So factory farms, these kinds of places where animals often find themselves, usually I would say, in deplorable conditions, and they're mistreated. And that is in a sense, to me, Nathan, a very overwhelming question, because, and there's a lot that you have to say here that you're going to be able to say, because we're so out of touch with our food and how it comes to us. if we're just picking it up in the grocery store, and those processes are so deeply ingrained in our culture. But how should we approach that kind of a topic, or that that kind of practice that's just so sewn in?
Yeah, and this is kind of challenging, Cameron, because all of the sudden you recognize the complexity of making any moral decision, which is that, okay, so you don't like the way that a chicken is raised in a massive farm. However, that provides extremely cheap protein to a lot of people who wouldn't afford that otherwise. And so very quickly, you run into human needs and animal needs in conflict. And that's where most of the big moral questions pop into existence. So, are sheep decimating some part of sub-Saharan Africa? Probably. Are you going to go tell the Maasai tribe not to graze sheep? Bad idea. So there's some real, it gets multivariable so fast. Now, here's the thing on on agricultural animal well-being is this, that the reason that animals are raised the way that they are is because that's what the market will support. You don't like the way that your chicken is raised, but you like $1.29 boneless, skinless chicken breast. And those two things are inextricably linked. You don't want to pay $18 or $27 for a chicken. And if everybody was willing to, then your chickens would be raised in a very different way. That's just the bottom line of it. And so it's not because we can't do other than, and it's not always that I think the farmers think that this is the best thing, but this is the only way to continue to exist financially in a system that will only pay a certain level for something. So just keep that in the back of our minds when we're having this conversation on a mass scale. Yeah. Now, the other thing is, and this is where I'm a little bit like on the fence of this, is that I'm all about honoring an animal for what it is. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of the animals that we now use in modern large-scale commercial agriculture have been bred specifically for those conditions and that production model. You don't get, like, your commercial meat chicken is not going to go live for 7 years running around out in the woods eating bugs and flying up and sleeping in the tree at night. And in fact, the people who raise them have pointed out, they call them meat birds, not chickens, because they act and behave so differently than a chicken. Basically, they like to sit in front of the trough and eat a lot of food for 6 weeks and then be a big old soft plump thing for your nugget. That's different than a chicken. So there's an odd thing of, like, we've almost bred animals that are designed to fit within this system. So I think, maybe a general principle would say that if we're going to honor creation, that we should treat the animal for what it is. And this is the question where, there'll be some diversity of opinion here of how do you respect the features of a chicken or the features of a pig or a cow or, whatever, and let it be one of what it is. Do chickens need access to grass? Do cows need to be able to leave a barn? Do pigs need to not live on concrete? All of these things where you might say, I think there's a line here saying, am I treating this animal as a creature or as a machine? And I think if we tend in the machine direction, that actually says more about us than anything else. So you can read the secular theories of utilitarianism on this. You can read the secular theories of deontological ethics on this. You can read about kindness and niceness theories, but very rarely are people writing about this from a virtue ethics perspective of saying, what kind of creature do I become if I participate in the system, and what changes am I willing, or what things am I not, like, where are the lines that I want to or not want to cross here? So it gets to be a complicated ball of wax in a hurry when you start factoring in kind of a geopolitical, socioeconomic, global system. I think, if you have the conviction and the ability to vote with your wallet, you can, but we want to recognize that we still live in a world that since the 60s has produced way more food than humanity can consume, and there are still people starving to death today. So to some point, we haven't aggregated our distribution and production models in a way, even with these massively efficient, and then there are other costs to our modern agriculture, but it gets complicated really fast.
So moving along here along these I suppose general lines, What about, I think we should bring the question of hunting in here as well. That's probably one major item we haven't touched yet here. So when it comes to hunting, there are those who will make a meaningful distinction between, say, hunting for, necessity and hunting for sport. How do you go about approaching that conversation? You and I both live in regions where hunting is a big part of life. And so many of our friends, people we love and hold dear, are, enthusiastic hunters. So how do you approach that? I know that came up several times. I mean, I think you guys probably spent a good 20 minutes on the subject of hunting on the Unbelievable podcast.
Yeah. So a couple of things here. The stereotypes always fly up here, but I want to point out, particularly if you're an American, we live in such a, it almost comes up as like you have these hunters who are these like ignorant backwoods hicks who just enjoy shooting stuff for the fun of it. And nobody's talking about like how advanced our ecological natural resource science and the professional biologists that are at work on setting, trapping limits and the seasons. And like, there's a phenomenal amount of intentionality and science that goes behind how it is that we manage our natural resources in this country. And we have totally messed that up in the past. And that's why we have legislation and laws and registrations and resources to do that well. So there are limits. Like, I can't go shoot as many deer as I want, because the local wildlife biologist in the state will do an analysis of what the birth rates, population, the food resources in the forest, and how many deer like overwintered well. And like, this is a highly technical, like very well thought out system of harvesting food, and the way that is, you can't kill a deer with just any rifle. Like, there are ethical considerations of like, this is deemed to be an improper way to kill a deer, and this is the proper way to do it. So it's a highly, and the people who care about it the most are the people who are hunters. If you look at conservation efforts that are due to the resources that come in through the hunting industry and the purchasing of like hunting licenses, if you care about wildlife and don't want to hunt, you should probably just go buy a hunting license and not use it. Like that money generates so much of the conservation. And you know who hates poachers the most? People who are responsible hunters. And you know who, like, I've seen like burly grown men almost cry at wounding an animal and not killing it quickly. Just people care so deeply about the proper way to do this that everybody that I've ever known flies in so deeply in the face of every stereotype that I've ever seen that it's almost a nonsense conversation every time that it begins to happen. So, I mean, hunting historically is like synonymous with eating meat. I think if you're okay eating meat, but you're not okay with hunting, you're just okay with somebody else doing your dirty work for you. So there's an honesty that comes from saying, if I'm going to eat meat, I'm going to be the one who takes its life, and I'm going to be respectful of that. Now, what's interesting to me is I've talked to people who farm like commercial farm scale, 80,000 turkeys a year or whatever, and they're like, yeah, but they shoot a deer and then kneel down and thank the Lord for the beauty of his creation. And there is a sense in which when you're hunting, you're watching the animal in its natural environment, and you feel yourself as part of that in a different way than you do on some other forms of agriculture. So I think there's some rich questions to be held there, but I also want to push back against anything that makes an overly simplistic or moral distinction there.
I've heard a lot of stereotypes when that question comes up, and none of them square with the people I know who are hunters. The profile I have in my mind fits what you've described. So one last question for you, Nathan, because I think it's an important word that's come up several times. But if you had to give a basic description, what does respect mean for you in the context of this conversation when we're talking about animals? You use the word respect. That's an interesting word here.
Yeah. So there is a sense in which there's the humility that is required to recognize that you are a creature among fellow creatures, and that God cares. You see this at every turn in the Old Testament, including notably in the end of Jonah, when he sends Jonah and he talks about not wanting to destroy the city, and he talks about, I have this many 100,000 people plus all the cattle. All the moral injunctions in the Old Testament about, how to take eggs out of a bird's nest in the whole 9 yards, all the way through, are filled with an understanding that there are other creatures and is not just about us. At the same time, when Jesus cast the demons out of the man and they go into the pigs, he does prioritize human needs over the needs of animals. And so there's a quote I really like by Aldo Leopold. He says that a conservationist is determined by the types of choices he makes when he's holding an axe. And what he means by that is it's not that a conservationist never chops down a tree. It's that they're thoughtful about what's going on here, what's the purpose of this, what do I need, what do I not need, and is making cognizant choices based on all the parameters that are available to them at the time. And I think the same thing is true with us in our interactions with animals. I don't shoot every animal that I see, even when I'm hunting. There are times when it's just the fun of being in the woods, and you say, it's beautiful to be here. Do I need this? If I don't, then I probably don't need to shoot it. So I think there would be a sense in which there are people who are just shooting things for fun, and then you stand on it and beat your chest like Tarzan or something. That there's no, that doesn't even fit closely with anything that Jesus taught. So I think it goes back to, what is this thing for? And you need to be asking yourself that question, not just in how you treat an animal, but also in how you treat your neighbor, and your own body. And so for me, this whole thing is part of a bigger conversation of what is it that we do with physical creation, our own lives and bodies included, and are we making discipled, disciplined choices based off of the character and nature of God about all things, or are we being hyper flippant with anything that's physical because we feel like it's less than because, we're super spiritual? So I see this as a point of discipleship when we start asking those types of questions of how do I properly integrate what Christ is forming in me with the way that I treat his creation. And even just setting up that paradigm in those questions is then going to change the way that I think about and treat my animals, and their needs and what they want to have. So, that's a short answer. What does it look like practically? For me, it's important that I make sure that every animal that I have has food and water every day before I eat. And so that's just a way of saying that I'm going to make sure that I don't have anything that's hungry or thirsty before I take care of my needs. And I'm going to eat them at the end of their lives, and so it's a sense in which I'm treating and respecting them for what they are, but I recognize that they are under my care and I have a responsibility toward them and for them. I think if the Lord is going to hold us accountable for every word that we speak, that we might be held accountable for a lot of other conditions of things too. And so I feel blessed to live at a place that is so full of animals. They're all over the place. And it's neat. It's a lot of fun. It's beautiful, and I live in that, but part of respecting it is also seeing that I'm a creature that's within it, and that I have a role to play in the ecology. And at the end of the day, all of it properly done leads to worship of thanking God for the goodness and just the sheer neatness of the way that the world is constructed and the gift that it is to live each day within it, and recognize that all of us, for better or worse, live within a system in which something must die in order for us to live. That's the heart of Christian theology right there, actually, isn't it? That something dies, that someone dies in order for us to live. And so there's a way, I think, have to quote Wendell Berry here, of saying that we live on the brokenness of a lot of things and the shedding of blood. And you can either do that flippantly, in which it's sacrilegious, or you can do it sacramentally and recognize that. I think it's like right on the cusp of morally obligatory to pray for your food if you have enough to eat, and to thank God for the system and the hands that went into preparing it, and thanking him for the way that he made animals to, you just think about the amazing thing that a cow does is it can go out in a field of grass that has zero nutritional value for a human and turn it into a ribeye. I mean, if that's not something to celebrate, I don't know what is. It's just like, it's wild the way that the world is put together, and we sit back, I think, and properly recognize that splendor, and it's right to praise God for it, that the things that we need to sustain us are actually pleasurable at times to consume. And like anything, there's gluttony and all kinds of other warps and vices that go along with it. But we don't want to make ourselves seem more than human by taking ourselves out of the ecological system, and we don't want to make ourselves less than human by denying the responsibility that we have toward the other creatures around us.
Therein lies a very powerful balance. And thank you, Nathan, for taking us down some avenues that may be new to some of us. Very helpful territory. And we hope this was helpful to you in a conversation that both of us think is going to become more front and center as an ethical issue in our cultural moment. But you've been listening to, and some of you now watching, which is fun. You can watch us now on YouTube. Go to our YouTube channel and watch our awkward expressions as we talk to each other. But you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.